Rudy, I think you're officially a member of the class now.
Yeah.
Congratulations. Remind me, I'll give you the book.
You have it?
I have a copy that I can give you.
Okay.
I mean, because you don't have it, right?
No. But, when I was at the office, you go ahead and sign that, a copy.
Oh, okay.
But they haven't pointed anything yet. I don't know.
Right. So did you request a copy?
I did.
Okay. Well, why don't you keep requesting it and I'll give you one of mine. I mean, I'll give you mine then. When yours come in, just give it back. All right, should we start? Okay, we're going to finish going through the article in much detail. And just to let you know that for the midterm and the final, what I'm going to do is I'll give you an article. I'll give it to you a few days before. And so then you can go through and read all the articles. And I'm going to ask you questions about the article on the exam. So there'll be some things that we don't cover here that we'll cover as we go along, like what's dependent variables, what's independent variables, things like that in more detail, and also different types of ways of kind of designing these studies. But the big thing that I want you to learn is just sort of how to go through and read one of these articles and then critically kind of ask yourself, all right, if I was to do this differently, like, what's the limitations of this article? I mean, the way that they did it. And if I were doing it differently, what other kind of study could I use to do it? And what would be the advantages and disadvantages of that type of study? So, these are the questions we'll start with. So, in this, what's meant by adverse childhood experiences? And how do they measure it? Yeah.
By adverse childhood experiences, they tend to mean things like violence, whether themselves or in the home, and kind of neglect or abuse before the age of 18.
And how do they measure it?
They give out like surveys.
Yeah, they did a questionnaire. So there's different types of adverse childhood experience questionnaires. So this is, they don't actually give the questionnaire in the study, but they do mention this, that you can get information in the supplemental materials. So this is oftentimes done for articles. Is like when you publish an article, the articles are pretty short, and so the journal's not going to put all the information in it. But what they'll say is that they put supplemental information on the website. So what I did is I went to the website where this journal is, found this article, and at the bottom it had a little tab, and so I clicked on the supplemental materials. So then this is the actual ACE score that they used here, the ACE questionnaire. And there's other things in the supplemental material here. So they mentioned in there is that there's, percentage comparison of total adult population in each region to sample demographics, et cetera, right? So this is the, what's it look like compared to Wales and the English regions. So they have all this other information that they put in there that, if you're interested, which I know you all are, is that you could go there and kind of see more detail in terms of what they did. Okay. So back to this. So what do they mean by health services usage? And how do they measure that?
Number of times like for general population, the emergency room, or how many nights they stay in the hospital.
Did they do it number of nights, or did they just do it whether they did it or not? I mean, yeah, you're probably right. Just that I thought, let's see, 3 types. So down further. Let's see, it should be in the method section, right? So it should be Here, let's see, for the letters, information of confidential information. Well, it should be in the supplemental materials too, right? Misty. So what I'm looking for is I'm looking to see, did they say that they used the number, whether or not they stayed, or did they use the number of like incidences? So let's see. So we have the instance of healthcare usage, GP use increased with ACE. Now state analysis. I'm sorry. So where you mean like in the supplemental materials or in questionnaire? Yeah. So let's see. Individuals were self-reported measures of healthcare use and 12 were collected. Number of visits to GP, etc. Right. But down here, yeah, but I thought, see, like when I looked at the analysis they were doing, they did a logistic regression. And usually a logistic regression just means yes or no, right? Rudy, you took statistics. Do you think that they use the number, or do you think that the number of visits, or do you think they use the whether or not they just had a visit? Let's see. I mean, the only reason it matters is because if they do number of visits, then what they're doing is they're not is they're trying to, they'll get like, is a higher ACE score associated with lots more visits, right? If they just use the yes or no, then they just get, did you use it or did you not use it? And so why not use the number of visits? Well, it could be just because it's more unreliable. Like, if you ask people how many times they went to the GP last year, or or in this case, it looks like more than 6 visits, more than 6 GP visits, so that they're, what they're doing is they're basically trying to identify what a high user is, I think, of GP visits. Why did they choose 6? No idea. I don't, oh yeah, so this one's more than one ED, and this is more than one hospital stay. So yeah, so they categorize it as in, did you use the ED? Did you stay overnight in the hospital? And did you have more than 6 visits? Why would they do more than 6 visits? Well, I don't think it says up here why they did more than 6 visits. But in reality, the way that they would have done it is they would have got this information from people about the number of visits. And then what they would have done is they probably would have done some different type of analysis to kind of see where the cutoff point was between people, where it became a predictor of ACE score. That's in reality what it would be. Now that kind of thing would come out in the review. So like when if I was reviewing this article, I'd sit there and say, why 6? What if you did the analysis with 4? What if you did it with 8? Does it change the analysis? And that's a common thing that reviewers will ask, because then they'll before the article gets accepted, they have to show you the results that show that either that yes, there's a reason why they use 6, or it didn't matter if they used 4 or 8. But if it turns out that 6 is an important thing, then as a reviewer, what you'd probably say is you'd say, well, put this in the limitations, is that you use the sort of arbitrary cutoff of 6 visits. How would you, if you wanted to know, like theoretically, how many visits is a high user, how could you do it? Like if you're a research assistant and they said, find out how many visits means a high user, what would you do? Yeah,
First we try from the average of the common sense report to the doctor.
so that's right. So one thing you do is you just sort of look in the literature and see, well, what's the literature say in terms of what do other studies use as high users? And so when you write the article then, and because there are studies out there that talk about high users. And then you could go and you can look at data from California and see, well, how many times do people normally use the GP? Is there data from California that you could get for that? Yeah, there's a survey called the CHIS survey, the California Health Interview Survey, which is a statewide survey done out of UCLA every year. That's where we get all of our information about the population comparisons for California. And so CHIS asks how many times you go to the GP. So you could just look at CHIS and see, what percentage of people go 1 time, 2 times, 3 times, etc. And that if there's a natural cutoff there, but what you're doing is that, it's not like there's any right answer to this, right? It's not like the skies open up and God says 6 is the number. Instead, you've got to kind of make a case for why it is that you use 6 rather than 5 or 8 or whatever it's going to be. And so that's part of the trick, not the trick. That's part of the challenge of writing articles, is trying to figure out kind of, how exactly are you going to figure out how to operationalize this variable? By operationalize, I mean, how do you take this concept of GP visits for high use GP visits and turn it into something that you're actually going to measure? That's what operationalize means. Okay, let's see. So why are well, first off, do the results show that ACEs are related to health services usage? Where do I see that? What table tells me that? Does that table tell it to me? The answer rhymes with so. No, that table doesn't tell it to you. Does this table tell it to me? The answer rhymes with guess. Yes, this is the table that tells it to me, right? And specifically here, this is what tells me. This says, well, first off, is having 1 ACE score, is that related to GP visits? Does that mean that, or let me say it this way. Are people who have 1 ACE score, an ACE score of 1, are they more likely to see a GP over 6 times than people who have ACE scores of 0? Well, why do you say yeah? I mean, because you're right, but you're not right too. So why do you say, why do you say yeah? Because you're looking at this number and you see that that number is greater than 1. And so therefore, which is the odds ratio, right? And if it's greater than 1, that means it's positively related to it. So if you have an ACE score that you're 13% greater chance of going to a GP. So that's the yes. What's the rationale for why the answer is no?
Because it was slightly.
Yeah.
But not quite.
And what's the statistical measure of only slightly? I'm going to have you tattoo this on your foreheads so that every morning you look in the mirror, you see this number. You see P is less than 0.05, right? P is less than 0.05. Say it.
P is less than.
Right. So now if you don't remember next time, we're getting the tattooist in here. And where do I find that? How do I know that in this case P is not less than 0.05? Like, what is the P value for this variable? Say it louder. 0.242, right there. So therefore it says that that number, is that greater than 0.05 or less than 0.05? Greater than, so it's not significantly, does that mean that variable is not significantly different than 0? How about having 2 to 3 ACE scores? Is that a significant predictor of going to the GP more than 6 times compared to people with 0? Yes. What percentage are they more likely to go? 49% more likely, right? Because that's the little 49 there. And what's the p-value? Well, it's less than 0.001, which is less than 0.05. So therefore, it's a significant predictor. Is having more than 4 ACE scores, is that significantly predicted to having an overnight stay in the hospital? Which column would I look at? Do I look in this column? This column? This column? Ding, 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 ding. And which number do I look at? Well, right there, right? That's more than 4 times. It's 2.67. So that means that they're like over 2.5 times more likely to spend. Someone with more than 4 ACE scores is more than 2.5 times likely to score to be in a hospital relative to someone with 0 ACE scores. So when I ask, what's the evidence? Is there evidence that that having higher ACE scores means that you have higher health services usage? You would then just look at these columns. Does being in a compared to being in a wealthy area, does being in a deprived area mean that that you're more likely to have higher GP visits, have more GP visits? Which column would I look at? First, second, or third? First, and then which row do I look at? Well, here's the deprivation area, right? Here's the wealthiest is a 1, the poorest is a 5. So it means that as you go from wealthy to poor, your chance of having GP visits goes up. And is it significant? Is that one significant? So less than P, is P less than 0.05? Yes. How about this one? Is that significant? No. That's greater than 0.05. That one? Yes. That one? Yes. Okay. So next question is, well, why? Why is it that ACEs might be related to health services usage? I mean, what's the rationale for why it is that it's related to it? Having higher ACEs means you have poorer health, right? Having poorer health means that you would use the doctor more, correct? If we were to do this study in the US, try and do the same thing, because they're clearly showing us that there's not very, I mean, there's some differences between deprivation areas, but not a lot. If we were to do this study in the US, would you see that that higher ACE scores necessarily lead to higher health services, higher GP visits? Well, this is in the UK, right? In the UK, healthcare is free, or at least it's universal healthcare. So everyone can go to the doctor, they can go to the hospital, and you don't really have to pay. But here in the US, where you have to have insurance, and people who have higher ACE scores are less likely to have health insurance. So therefore, they're not necessarily more likely to go to a GP. They may be more likely to go to an emergency room. But what screws it up here, what screws up the relationship here is that in the US, there is not everyone who has health insurance. So you can't all access the GP or a hospital in the same way that you can in the UK. So I mention this because, that's what's kind of going in the background. When they go through and that they're looking at the study and they're trying to explain the results, is that one of the big things that you kind of think is that, oh, this is being done in Wales and England, whereby everyone can have free access to healthcare. Whereas if it was done in the US, you then would have to go through and start to think about, well, if you look at the variables that they included in here, right? So they have ACE score, deprivation, age, gender, ethnicity, and then region, right? But what they don't have is they don't have insurance status. Whereas in the US, any study like this, you're going to see insurance status, and you're also going to see income in there as well, because income and insurance status are such a big predictor of who gets healthcare that, if you're going to look at healthcare usage. So how do I know all this, right? How would I go about figuring this out? Well, this is where your theory comes in. So behind, when they set up a study like this, is that you've got some type of theory, and it could be a formal theory or just your own view of the world in terms of how things operate. And so one of the reasons why when you set up a study, you go through and you read all the literature, that is to try and get this idea about, okay, so why do I think that there's a link here? And what is it that might cause differences between regions and between different types of people and et cetera. Okay. Discussion. So I said that that in the discussion section, then that's usually where you have your first kind of summary about what the findings are. So ACEs are strongly predictive of GP usage, et cetera. Goes through and says that. And then, the impacts on ACE appear to be established through beginning in childhood, et cetera. So what this paragraph does then is it's kind of summarizes the results. Then relationship to other studies. That's usually the next section of a discussion or introduction, discussion or conclusion section, is that they go through and that they'll talk about how this relates to other studies. Then they do limitations. So limitations is important because this is sometimes the limitations are reasonable limitations, and sometimes you'll see limitations that say things like, it could be that aliens were controlling people's minds when they answered these questions, and so therefore, when you see something really bizarre like that, it probably means that the reviewer said, "Well, wait a minute, did you measure whether aliens are measuring people's minds?" And so the way you get around that is this: when you rewrite, when you respond to the reviewers, you say, "Excellent point. Well, you're right. We didn't check on aliens." So we'll put that as a limitation, that the results could have been caused by aliens, controlling our brains. But this is where the limitation section, okay? So they say interpretation of results is limited by overall response rate of 59.5%. So is that low, 59.5%? How would you know whether it's low? Well, it's partly based on the methodology, right? So in this case, the methodology was just send out something to everyone and send it out to all these households and then go and try to see the households. So if you do that, it's going to be low. I think actually when I look at this, I think 60% response rate, pretty good actually, just to find that there's 6% of people agree to at least talk to them. That's higher than if you go down to the fair and try to put a survey out at the fair. Well, Rudy, you did that. You went to Madeira. How many, the people you asked, what percentage of people would come over and talk to you?
Really low.
And how'd you go through and get people to come and finally talk to you?
Pretty much trying to convince them, and you have to kind of have an incentive if you really want to motivate them.
Give them a shirt. I think we tried to give them shirts, right? That didn't work very well. Shirts, turns out UC Merced shirts, not that big demand down there in Madeira at the flea market. So instead, what works is to give them gift cards, right? So a gift card of like to Target or to Food Max or something like that. That works really well. So if you give them gift cards, then what kind of issues arise when you give people gift cards? Are there ethical issues to giving people gift cards? What if I said, I want to pay you $100 to take my survey? Right? Would ethics you've all been through ethics training now, would ethics have a problem with that?
Like they felt like they couldn't back out of it because they were like, oh, I'm gonna get this.
What if I said, I'm gonna give you a survey from my research, you take it, or I'm gonna fail you this class. Would that be ethical? No, because you have to be volunteers to the research. So can't do that. If I said, take it and in response, in return, I'll write you a letter of recommendation. Could I do that? No, unethical to do that. If I said, I'll give you a $5 gift card to go over here to the lantern, could I do that? Yeah, probably do that. But if I said, if you want to do, well, we did, this farm worker study where we had 1,500 farm workers and we gave them either $25 or $50 gift cards. So is that unethical? Survey took about an hour and a half to do, hour and a half to 2 hours. Unethical to give them $25 to $50? No, probably not. I mean, because there is the sense that you do want to cite kind of, you see, you can't pay them to take the survey. What you could do is you can thank them. And the way you thank them is that you say, take this, we're going to give you gift cards for $50. But if they turn around, they say, if they just look at the survey and say, I don't want to take it, do they still get the $50 gift card? Yes. So when you write your ethics, when you write in your IRB, your ethics, is that you have to say is that they're going to get the gift card regardless of whether or not they complete the survey or not. You just give it to them. And the reason is because if you say, I'm going to give you a gift card, $50 gift card for filling out my survey, and then I start saying, tell me about your most embarrassing sexual experience. And you think, I don't want to answer that question, right? But I want the $50. They want to break that linkage between the two things. So they basically say they let people is that if there's some question in there that they don't want to answer, they don't have to. If they want to walk away from the survey, they can. And they still get their $50 because it's not payment. It's just a gift. It's compensation. Okay, in this case, then, so they go around. So that's pretty good. Finally, our design was retrospective, therefore only correlational, not causal relationships between exposure to ACEs and subsequent healthcare usage could be established. So what's meant by a retrospective survey? I mean, why was this thing retrospective? Well, think through what they did. They went to someone's house and they said, would you be willing to take this survey? And then they sit down with them and they ask them about, their ACEs scores, and they ask them about GP usage, and they ask them about, in the past year and about hospitalization, et cetera. It's retrospective because what they're doing is they're asking them about what happened in the past. That's what meant by a retrospective survey. A prospective survey means that you're going to follow them into the future. So how could you set this thing up as a prospective survey? Like if you want to do a prospective survey of this, so what would they have done? So assume they did the same thing. They went to people's house and they said, so we want to be part of the survey. And people said yes. Would they still give them an ACE score? An ACE test? Yeah, because there's no way you can, you're asking about things that happen in childhood. So unless you recruit children and measure them all through up to age 18 and in real time record their ACE score, you have to ask them their perspective on that. But could you prospectively gather information about their healthcare usage? Like if I wanted to measure all your healthcare usage throughout the semester, I could wait till the end of the semester. And I could ask you, how many times did you go to the student health center? What's the other way I could do it? Yeah. Yeah, I could give you a journal and I could say every time that you go to the student health center, just write down that you went, right? I could call you up every night and say, hey, go to the health clinic today? Say, nope. Next night, go to the health clinic. I mean, it's prospective because what you're doing is you're following people through time. What's the advantage of doing it that way? What's the advantage of a prospective rather than retrospective? Yeah. Better accuracy. Right? If I asked you, how many times did you go to the GP in the past 2 years? Could you answer me? I'd have to really think about it to think how many times. So it's going to be somewhat inaccurate. On the other hand, if you measure it, if you prospectively measure it, then you'll get much better information about how many times it went to GP. Mhm. What's the downside of a prospective study like that? Yeah, really, and really expensive. I mean, if you think about this, they go to someone's house and they talk to them for an hour and then they're gone. This one would require following people for a year and going through and calling them. But so, you get accuracy, but it's more expensive and takes longer. And so those are the types of things when we start to look at articles, is that, you kind of want to go through and ask yourself, well, what other type of designs can we use? And what I would expect you to do on the test is be able to, like if I were on a test, say, give me another type of design they could have used, right? And you could say, oh, well, they could do a prospective study. And here's how they could do it. They could, go recruit people and then follow them up for a year. And they would give them a journal, or they would call them up, or they would agree to let them have the person access their healthcare records, or whatever it's going to be, right? But it's like solving those type of problems and telling me in the exam kind of how you would generally do that. Good. Okay. Then keep going. Acknowledgements. And then declaration of conflict of interest. So, usually, like I've never had a conflict of interest in a study, but oftentimes, like if I review an article, especially drug articles, articles on pharmaceuticals, is that if you look into if you look at who the authors are, is that oftentimes that there'll be authors who work for the drug companies. And so that's, there were some bad things that happened maybe 15, 20 years ago. There was what it turned out is that, when drug companies would put in because drug companies hire researchers, when they would submit an article, is that they were often getting rejected because the reviewers would say, well, wait a minute, you have too much of a financial interest in terms of showing that this drug is really good. And so then you started to get this whole slew of articles being submitted by professors at kind of small universities. And it turned out that what was happening is that the drug companies were going to these professors and say, hey, we really would like to be a consultant, and we're going to pay you $20,000 to publish this article. And they would then, the person would technically write the article, but not really. The drug company would really write it. And so that started to become a real scandal. And so now, they like for me, I would never take money from a drug company now, because once you take money from the drug company, then you have to start on your conflict of interest, putting that down there. And the big one that you never take money from for public health researchers is what would we never take money from? Tobacco companies. Never take money from tobacco companies, because tobacco companies do the same thing. They'll give you all the data, and if you go through and publish things that are good with them, that then they'll go through and they'll give you all sorts of money and things. So says where the ethics approval was obtained. And then finally, references. So references are really important, because references is when you go through in that, like when I review an article, what I do is I look to see where the references are. And I oftentimes will go to an article that they cite, because if they say that the article, like previous studies have done this, I'll sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes go and just check, did the previous study actually say that? This formatting of the, there's different ways to format references. How did they determine the format in this way? Well, the journal will tell them. The journal will say, use APA style, or use whatever style it is. Okay, that's it. Any questions about this? Okay. Let's do another one then. You haven't seen this. I put it online, this one, but you haven't seen it. So let's go through and just kind of, we'll just do it together. So title. Good title. What's title supposed to do? Yeah, draw your attention, tell you what it's about. Does this pretty much tell you what it's about? Yeah, I think so. See the authors. Structured or unstructured? Abstract? Unstructured, right? Unstructured because it doesn't sort of say objective methods, etc. So this is unstructured abstract. Then if I want to know what the article is about, tell me how to read it. What should I read? I mean, short of reading the entire thing. If I just want to summarize, get a sense about what the article is about, what should I do? Okay. Well, let's do that. So here we are. Okay, so this is the last one. The study of the relationship between cancer patients' use and alternative medicines and their perceived mental health status. We followed a cohort of patients under the care of the University Hospital of Tromsø for 5 years after diagnosis. Patients' use of alternative medicines has been described in more detail elsewhere. The main hypothesis tested was whether mental distress is more common among users of alternative medicine. Does that tell you what they did? Prospective or retrospective study? Prospective, right? Because you're following people over time. So it's a prospective study. So now the question is, well, what's alternative medicine? Well, they refer to this. So obviously they published something else on this where they talked about what alternative medicines are. But if I want to figure out, well, okay, so now I got their what they're doing. If I want to know how it all came out, where should I go to? Yep. First paragraph of the discussion. So go all the way down. So it kind of just dives into talking about what it means for other, how they're comparison with other studies, right? So it doesn't really talk about what they did, what they found per se. But then if you read on, this one here. So what's that tell you? So what do you think happened in this study? I mean, before we even go and look at the results, what do you think happened in this study? They were measuring cancer patients, the use of alternative medicines. Right. Which is, how is that going to impact their study? So you're losing part of your sample, and you're if you think about the rationale, what's the rationale for a study like this? I mean, what's the logic behind why do they think that cancer patients, that there might be association between cancer patients' depression and use of alternative medicines? So let's see. Could be that people with cancer use alternative medicines and then get depressed, right? It could be that people with cancer get depressed, don't have good experiences with their current treatment, and so try other things, and so try alternative medicines. So part of the problem that they're going to face is this problem about how to sort out the causality between that. And that they're not really doing a randomized control trial where they're giving some people alternative medicines and other people not. I mean, that would be a way that you could test it. Would it be ethical to do that for this group? if I were to propose a randomized controlled trial and say, well, what I want to do is get cancer patients. I'm going to give some cancer patients access to alternative medicines and not other cancer patients. Would that be ethical? Yeah, say it again. Yeah, the risk outweigh the benefits. Mhm. And that they would think an ethics committee, yeah, I mean, maybe some ethics committee would approve it, but most ethics committees would say, well, wait a minute. If it's not effective, alternative medicines, then you're just wasting these people's time and you're giving them alternative medicines that may mean that they're not going to use, traditional medicines. On the other hand, they might say, if it is effective, then you're denying these people access to something that's effective. And so it's a bind that researchers face when they want to do randomized controlled trials for populations like this. And it's like, well, how do you make the case for randomizing something? And it becomes a catch-22 because, you can make the case, say, well, we don't think it's going to be effective, of which case they're going to say, well, wait a minute, you're taking cancer patients and you're giving them something that you don't think is going to be effective. Or they could say, well, we think it's going to be effective. And they're going to say, well, wait a minute, you're taking these cancer patients and not giving them something that you think is effective. So the way that they opt, yeah. Yeah. So they can, so one way they do it is they give everyone the same treatment and then they phase in certain things. So they'll say like with one group, okay, for the first, everyone's going to get the standard treatment. And you're going to get the alternative medicine for a month. And then you're going to get the alternative medicine for a month. And so they do it that way. So what that does is everyone will eventually get it. So it's not like they're denying people the care, but it's just more that they do it in a phased approach. So they do things like that to try and get around it. Okay, and then table 1, let's see if table 1, what does table 1 show? Table 1's almost always show the same thing. What's it showing? Demographics, right? So demographics of the population. Then the results. Influence of alternative medicines on patients' perceived mental health status as compared by the GHQ-20. What's a GHQ-20? We go up here. We'll see it's the General Health Questionnaire 20. Guess how many items are on the GHQ-20? That's right. There's also another common one they use is the SF-36. Guess how many items are on the SF-36? Oh, never mind. I'm going to put this on the test. Okay. So the GHQ-20, it's a general health questionnaire. So anyways, you could go through and read it and see, can they figure out the causality here? Can they figure out whether alternative medicines lead to depression or whether depression leads to alternative medicine, and how does the fact that that so many patients are dying along the way kind of influence their ability to make that call? Right. So questions? So yeah.
I just wondered, would the stage of would the stage of the patient affect the results on the study?
You think so, right? Right? I mean, is that what you're thinking? Is that, yeah. So like if you think if a stage, well, even like if the prognosis, let's say, would the prognosis affect their use of alternative medicines in their depression? Yes, right, definitely. So it's like, well, how do you control for prognosis in this type of study? Okay. So that's how to read an article. Any questions about that? I'm going to just, from here on, I'm going to assume that I can give you articles and you'll kind of know kind of that in general, how to quickly go through and read them. And then you'll also know that if I say things like, tell me what the dependent variables are and tell me what the independent variables are, you'll know where to go. If I say, tell me the limitations, you'll know where to go, right? Okay. All right. So now we're going to talk about scientific method. Have you ever had a class where they talked about the scientific method? We talked about like the philosophy of science? You ever, like in, you're nodding your head. Where have you? Uh-huh. Yeah. How many people had in high school kind of something where they talked about hypothesis testing, things like that? Oh, we might be able to forego the whole lecture. Okay, so tell me about what's meant. Tell me the basics for science. How does science work? Yes. So you ask a question and you formulate a hypothesis, and then you go through a series of steps to answer your question. Does that sound right? So, okay, let's think of a research question. Does eating apples lead to people staying away from the doctor? Okay, it's my research question. So how is that a hypothesis? What's the hypothesis? Okay, the people eat apples, they won't go to the doctor. That's called a null hypothesis, right? And so what you do is you state your research question and you say, my research, I think, my prediction is that people eating apples will have fewer, will be healthier than people who don't eat apples. And so I'll state that as a null hypothesis, where it says people who eat apples are no more healthy than people who don't eat apples, right? And why do I state it as a null hypothesis? Why do I flip it around like that? Let's see. When I test something, so am I going to go out there and find proof that that eating apples? Let's say if I do a study and I give this half the class apples, and I give this half the class no apples. I forbid you for eating apples, and then I measure health. How do we want to measure health? Say it again. Dentist visits. That's a good idea. Oh, how about just we'll give you a dental exam? How about that? I'll give you a dental exam after 6 months. Okay. So this part of the class, I'm going to give you apples. This part of the class, I'm going to forbid you from eating apples. And after 6 months, I'll bring a dentist in and we'll look at your teeth and we'll see, do the people who went to the ate apples, are they healthy or not? Is dentist the right visit? I'm questioning the dentist now, because apples have a bunch of sugar. So I'm giving you guys sugar, and I'm forbidding you from eating sugar. So maybe you're actually worse off. So maybe not dentist, maybe we have to use something else. Yeah? A general physician? Okay, go to GP visits. So you're just going to be overall healthier. I mean, we could do dentists as well, but I don't know which way what to predict off of that. So we'll do the apple a day keeps the doctor away. We'll look at the number of GP visits and to see whether or not you have fewer GP visits than you have over here. Sound good? That's the basic study. So when I actually go through and test, so I after 6 months, I measured the number of GP visits, and now I'm going to compare your GP visits. I'm going to test whether you have more GP visits than you have GP visits, correct? So why bother with this whole null hypothesis thing of saying is that my null hypothesis is that there's no difference between the two? Well, what I'm actually testing, right, is I'm going in the null hypothesis says there's no difference between these two groups. And so what I'm looking to see is that, well, is this group over here significantly higher than this group over here. So, let's say if you have an average of 1.2 visits and you have an average of 1.1 visit, what I'm looking to see is that a big enough difference to make the case that yes, this is important. So how do I know whether it's a big enough difference? What's my measure of whether it's a big enough difference? Well, say it again. What are we going to do? We're going to look at these two numbers and we're going to see if these two numbers are different from each other. And what criteria am I going to use to determine whether they're different from each other? I'll give you a hint. You're going to see it in the mirror in the morning. P is less than 0.05, right? So that's what a statistical test does. It tests to see whether or not these two numbers are the same. If P is greater than 0.05, that means that they're different or the same. If P is greater than 0.05, does that mean that the numbers are different or the same? The same, right? If P is less than 0.05, then that means that you're going to say, oh, these numbers are different. So what the null hypothesis does is it says, well, let's start by assuming that both groups are the same, that apples don't work, don't cause you to be healthier, and that therefore what we're going to do is we're going to just measure these, and then we're going to get differences between the two groups, and then we'll see, are those differences statistically significant? And P less than 0.05 means that this number over here is different than that one, because this number over here would only occur less than 1 in how many times? Less than 1 in 20 times, right? 1 in 20 times, that's 0.05, right? 5%, 1 in 20. So what it says is that you're going to set the test such that if they're both the same, you would only get this type of difference between the two groups out of 1 out of every 20 groups. All right, well, let's go through it. Okay, first thing from the book says, and I'll go through this quickly, but stop me if you have questions. The book makes the distinction between method and methodology, right? So method is the steps and methodology is the application of the methods. So when we talk about the scientific method, we're talking about steps. And if you talk about you following the scientific methodology, it means that you've followed those steps. There's next the ontology. The ontology refers to basically how you view the world, right? And then the other thing then is the epistemology, which is basically deals with how you get information. So like this is one that I just picked out, which is like this is for healthcare. So what it does is it basically shows someone's schema of how it is that they view the world. I mean, in our world, in our language, that type of view of the world usually is a theory. We usually have some type of theory that we're going to use about how the world works, right? So, for example, when we were talking about healthcare and in the other paper, and we said that, well, people in Wales and England with high ACEs scores are going to have worse health. Worse health means that you go to the GP more, and so that's the linkage. Well, if you think, there's a number of different assumptions going on there. Is that one is the assumption that ACEs score leads to worse health, but then the other one is that worse health leads to more GP visits. I could have said, we'll say that ACE score leads to worse health leads to, wearing hats. Is that if that was my view, my theory, my view of the world, people would be right to say, well, wait a minute, please tell me why it is that ACEs score leads to people wearing hats, or ill health leads to people wearing hats. And maybe you have some reason for thinking that, but that reasoning that you're going through, that's the ontology. That's your underlying reason and way of looking at the world. What this means, as we'll talk about, as we'll show, is that there is no such thing as an objective science. That is that there's no such things as facts, right? And there's no such things as proof, because all those things depend upon your view of the world. And if you go through the history of science, there's been a lot of cases where whereby people have, kind of thought things like, I don't know, well, things like eugenics. Eugenics was very popular in the 1920s, and it was the dominant kind of thought about how scientists saw the world. And so, the U.S. was leading the world in terms of eugenics research, talking about differences between races and differences between Southern Italians versus Northern Italians, and so it was really, really well elaborated. And then World War II hits, and Hitler kind of takes eugenics to its natural conclusion. And then what happened is that suddenly eugenics becomes, something that until recently, scientists wouldn't, didn't ascribe to anymore. So that's something for which, were these scientists sort of following the scientific method back in the 1920s? Yes, they were. But they were following the scientific method using a view of the world that just is, that was guiding their whole research, what they did. And the point being is that we all do that now, that there is no way that you can have truly objective research. And so when people start to come out and say, well, I follow science, right? Is that, well, yeah, you'd like to think that you're following the scientific method, but don't confuse that with saying that everything's objective, because there is no such thing as objective. Anything that we do is going to come through our view of the world, and your view of the world is determined by kind of, your experiences and your theories and all those other kind of things that go along with it. All right, epistemology is the way we know things. I think that science is one type of way of knowing things. And so when we talk about the scientific method, that what we're talking about is essentially the way you go through and trying to figure things out, given your view of the world. But there's lots of other types of ways that you can know things. And so oftentimes, one of the issues that we're having is that in the US is that, people are taking their facts from sources that's not the scientific method. And so it's not like it's wrong. It just means you're talking from two different places. For example, like if you think about religion, right? If you're a Christian, then you think, and you're looking at your view of the world, and you're thinking about, well, where is it that's going to guide my understanding of the world? Is that you would look to the Bible. If you're a Muslim, you would look to the Quran. I mean, is that wrong to do that? Well, no, it's just a different way of kind of knowing information. And so one of the things that to be clear about this is that, well, science is one way of knowing information along the way, but oftentimes, people are going to have other types of ways of knowing information that enter into it. Okay. So in terms of ways of getting information, you can rely upon authority, you can rely upon reasoning, or you can have the scientific method. So reasoning, that's where you're trying to figure out, based upon your view of the world, kind of logically, what is the how can you make statements about what without actually observing something. So for example, if more people like vanilla, chocolate than vanilla, and more people like vanilla than strawberry, then you would say, oh, so therefore more people like chocolate than strawberry, right? That's using reasoning. If you've ever taken a logic class, is that they go through this, kind of ad nauseum about all these different types of ways of these if-then statements and such. But those all are, is that those are just kind of using reasoning as the way of understanding information. The scientific method then kind of is something for which it's just a different way of doing it. In terms of how you go through it and sort of view the scientific worldview, right, is that the idea is that the world view exists independent of our beliefs, so that exists independent of our beliefs, so that therefore there is a common set of facts. So that's where science starts to get into when you start talking about that there are facts. Like there are things like gravity, right? Gravity we think of as a fact, and that if you drop your pen, it's going to fall to the ground. So that's a fact. And so, in the physical sciences, that there are a lot more things that are kind of everyone sort of agrees on. But even in the physical sciences, if you read physics, about debates in physics, they have a lot of anomalies that they can't explain. And the way that they try to explain it depends ultimately upon their view of the world. So there are actually, aren't a huge number of things that you can actually say these things are facts or not. So the scientific method is based upon positivism. And what positivism means is that we are going to observe rules, observe things, and then use those rules to kind of make predictions about what's going to happen in the future. And so the way that it operates, the way the scientific method operates is that, we use theory or reasoning or whatever it's going to be to come up with our model for how the world's going to work. And that from that, then we get testable predictions, and that we then go ahead and we operationalize what that's going to mean. And then we gather data, and then we observe the results. So there are some things that you can't do this with. So for example, is there a God? Could you scientifically prove or test whether there's a God or not? How would you test it? If I want to test whether there's a God, or there's not a God, how would you test there's not a God? Let's say your theory is that there's no God. How would you test it? No one wants to give me a test for anything. How about if we say we're going to have this group of people over here pray that I grow taller, and we'll have this group of people over here pray that I grow shorter, and then or may not pray at all, right? So this group prays, this group not prays, and so therefore then we'll see whether or not I grow taller. Is that a test? I mean, they've done this in hospitals, right? They've done this in hospitals where they have a group of people pray for patients, never see the patients don't know they're being prayed for. And they have another group of people, who don't pray for the patients, obviously. Other patients who aren't prayed for. And then they look to see, do patients who get prayed for, do they have better outcomes? What do you think the results are?
Isn't it a matter of the perception of the world as well? Because if there is a God or not, I guess you could say an extreme is like jump off the cliff and
Yeah.
you survive. Or a negative is all the bad stuff in the world. But if you believe in God, at the end of the day you can ask, but depending what you receive will depend on him or not. Like if you want to grow taller, it doesn't depend or not.
Let's say if I have cancer and I want to pray, I ask God, cure my cancer for me, right? And let's say my cancer gets cured. Proof? What if my cancer doesn't get cured? Proof that there's no God? I mean, let's say you're the skeptics over here, and you're the people who believe in God over here, right? So skeptics, if I say I had cancer, I prayed that God would cure my cancer, and I'm cured. Proof that there's a God? Skeptics? Yeah.
Depends on what cancer it is, right?
Okay. Yeah.
It's a treatable or untreatable cancer.
It was untreatable.
Like-
Untreatable cancer.
Glioblastoma, right? There's no cure. I meant uncurable, right?
Right.
Like you can pray as much as you want, you're gonna die someday, right?
Right.
It's like-
But I have a miraculous. I wake up one morning and that I no longer have it.
that's
So you're a skeptic on this side of the room though, and you're saying that you're converted already. Okay, you have to go to this side of the room now. The rest of you, there's got to be some skeptic in here that is going to go say, tell me why that this is not proof that there's God. Nothing? How about stuff just happens sometimes? These things just occur, right?
Are you a habit? If you certain habits changes the outcome of your
Could be. Well, on the other side, what if What if if I have cancer and I pray and I don't get better? And, so I turn around to you and I say, look, this is obviously evidence that there's no God, because I prayed really hard that God would cure my cancer and didn't do it. So what's the response?
If this wasn't a start,
Well, wasn't meant to be. So there's some type of, right?
That's that person. So,
Yeah.
like you said, like let's say that was you're praying and you don't get better,
Mhm.
and you really say, okay, well, there is no God. I think that wouldn't prove if God is real or not, but to that person, that's like their proof, their evidence that they took.
Oh, that's a good point. So you're saying is that for this person, then that's more, but from a scientist, but as a scientist, right? I'm taking the scientific view, and is that, and you're saying, well, yes, there is a God, but sometimes God decides not to cure people, right? And you're saying there's no God. Sometimes people just get better, right? Can you prove them wrong? No, because anything that you offer for proof is that they can come up. Like, for example, the example about praying for people in the hospital is that turns out that, yeah, people get prayed for in the hospital. There are some studies that show that they get better when people aren't prayed for. So that would suggest, skeptics explain that one. But then you could say, well, because of all these other studies that people get prayed for and they just didn't publish them so you say something like that. Anything I offer as proof of God, they can come up with another rationale for it. Anything I come up with as proof of no God, they can come up for an alternative explanation for it. So, and I say this with confidence because people much, much smarter than all of us have for hundreds of years been trying to prove the existence of God, and that, can't be done because it's something that is just you can't get a testable hypothesis out of it. Can I get a testable hypothesis about this thing called gravity? Yes, I can get a testable hypothesis out of that because I can drop it, and if it goes down, I predict if I drop it, it's going to go down, and if it goes down, then I've got evidence for it. Maybe one time it goes up, but that's okay. It's still a testable hypothesis, right? You can have a testable hypothesis that's wrong, or that's not supported by the data, but it's still a testable hypothesis. Okay. So then the other thing in terms of the scientific method is that there's the difference between induction and deduction. So induction, that's deriving general statements from observation of nature. Deduction is starting with a theory and then coming up with predictions based upon the theory. So induction is like, you notice that the sun rises in the east, sets in the west. And so you notice that over a number of different days, and you think to yourself, oh, I'm going to predict that tomorrow the sun's going to rise in the east and that it's going to set in the west. You don't have to have a theory to do that, right? Your theory might be is that, well, there's a winged chariot that drags the sun across the sky every day, and that at the next day the winged chariot starts again. You could have that theory, or have a theory about some earth rotating type thing. It doesn't matter. What you're doing is that you're not based upon theory. You're based upon just upon the fact that you're observing something and then seeing if it happens and using that as the basis for predictions. So, gravity, you can have lots of different theories for why it is that my pen falls to the ground, but it doesn't matter because you're just doing it based upon induction. Deduction is when you have a theory, and that based upon the theory, you make predictions. So, for example, if I were to say, we're going to start having a $50 tax on every pack of cigarettes, what do you think would happen to sales of cigarettes? Plummet. Why do you think that? Because $50 is a lot of money. So therefore, and you think to yourself, well, okay, $50, probably people aren't going to want to spend $50 on cigarettes. And so therefore you expect the sales of cigarettes to plummet. Because you've observed other things. When the price goes up of something, people buy less of it. What else would happen? If they started having $50 taxes on cigarettes in California, and there were no taxes in Nevada, what would happen?
of a healthier population.
Oh, you're such an optimist. Good on you. I was going to say is that people drive their cars over Nevada and return back with truckload and with buckets of cigarettes and start selling them on the streets, right? So, you could also then predict that there's going to be a black market that arises for cigarettes because of it. Why do I think that? Well, because I've observed other, I have a theory about what happens when something gets banned and that people then try to find other way. So, but all this is all deduction. I haven't actually, there's been no place that they've tried to charge $50 on a pack of cigarettes, but I have a theory. And so I go out and make predictions based upon it. So you can do predictions based upon either way. You can do it based upon just observing things and then, or you can have a theory and then make predictions based upon that. Okay. So what we were talking about before with null hypothesis, that's referred to as the hypothetical deductive method. And the idea is that you start with a theory, right? Theory can be based on previous studies, can be based upon your induction, whatever it's going to be. And then you have a research question. And then you state your research question, like I think that raising the tax on cigarettes to $50 is going to cause the numbers to fall. And then you go through and that you state that as a null hypothesis. You think, well, I think that raising the tax on cigarettes to $50 is going to have no impact on the sales of cigarettes. And then you collect data, and then you go through and that you analyze the data, and then you test whether or not your null hypothesis is supported by the data. That is that you test to see whether you can say is that there's no evidence that no statistical difference between the sales at $50 and sales at $0. That's the basic idea. All right, well, let's stop there. We'll start the next one. Have a good Labor Day. Stop this.